If you walk into your next interview thinking the process is neutral, you're already behind. Somewhere between your resume landing in a queue and you shaking hands in a final round, decisions are quietly being made about you that have almost nothing to do with fairness. Recruiters move fast, protect their time, and read signals you don't even realize you're sending. Most job seekers never see any of this. They just get a rejection email and wonder what went wrong. Today, I'm walking you through 11 things recruiters know but almost never say out loud, so you can stop guessing. Hey, it's Dre. I've spent years on the inside of hiring processes, sitting in recruiting rooms, compensation planning meetings, and the conversations that happen right after a candidate walks out and everyone starts talking honestly. I've watched strong resumes get skimmed in seconds, watched hiring managers overrule recruiters for reasons nobody wrote down, and watched offers get built around people who did almost nothing differently except understand how the room actually worked. So none of this is theory. It's what actually happens behind the closed door. If that's useful to you, the easiest way to keep getting it is to hit subscribe. Because next week, I'm breaking down what really happens once a salary negotiation starts, and you're going to want that one too. Here's the reframe worth sitting with before we get into the list. None of what I'm about to tell you means the system is rigged against you, and it isn't some conspiracy designed to trip you up. It's closer to this. Hiring is a fast, imperfect, high-volume process, and the people running it are usually optimizing for speed and risk reduction, not for finding the objectively best person every single time. Once you understand that, these 11 things stop feeling like tricks and start feeling like information you can actually use. The first thing worth knowing is that most of what lands in an applicant pool is functionally noise. When a role opens, applications tend to pour in fast, and in systems I've worked in, only a small slice of that pool is genuinely qualified for what's being asked. That's not a judgment on job seekers. It's usually just a reflection of how easy it is to apply for almost anything with one click. What this means for you is that if your background is a legitimate match and your resume actually communicates that clearly, you're not really competing against hundreds of equally strong candidates. You're usually competing against a much smaller group buried inside a much bigger pile. The catch is that nobody's digging through that pile patiently to find you, so you have to be visible immediately or risk getting lost in volume that has nothing to do with your qualifications. It also means the odds are usually better than they feel from the outside. A flooded inbox looks discouraging, but most of what's flooding it was never really in contention to begin with. Second, before a real set of human eyes carefully reads your resume, it's usually filtered, sorted, or quickly scanned. Some combination of software and a recruiter moving through dozens of profiles in one sitting. This is often less about some mysterious algorithm rejecting you and more about basic pattern matching. Does your experience roughly line up with the role? Are the right terms present? Is the formatting clean enough to parse quickly? A resume that's visually cluttered or organized in a confusing way can get deprioritized before anyone fully absorbs what you've actually accomplished. The caveat here is that this isn't about gaming anything. It's about removing unnecessary friction so a tired recruiter scanning quickly doesn't have to work to understand why you're relevant. And this is where it gets more interesting, because once you're actually in front of someone, a completely different set of rules takes over. Third, the window you have to make a strong first impression is brutally short. In a lot of hiring conversations, an initial read on a candidate forms within the first few minutes, sometimes based on nothing more than how you open, how you carry yourself, and how clearly you explain your own background. That early read tends to color everything that follows. It isn't necessarily fair, but it's how attention and time-pressed evaluation tends to work. Once someone mentally files you into a promising category or a doubtful one, it usually takes something fairly dramatic to shift that impression later. The practical takeaway is that your opening minute deserves as much preparation as any technical question you're expecting. Fourth, and this tends to surprise people, a real sense of whether you're moving forward often forms extremely early in the interview itself. Sometimes within the first 10 minutes, often by the second or third real question. That doesn't mean the rest of the conversation is meaningless. It can still shift things, but the early tone tends to set expectations for everything after it. If you stumble badly in the opening stretch, recovery isn't impossible, but you're now working uphill instead of building on momentum. Knowing this changes how you should think about preparation. It isn't just about having good answers ready. It's about which answers you lead with. Fifth, here's something that frustrates a lot of genuinely qualified candidates. The strongest resume in the stack doesn't automatically become the strongest hire. Interviewing is its own skill, separate from competence. And people who communicate clearly, build rapport quickly, and seem comfortable under mild pressure often outperform people who are more qualified on paper but stiffer in conversation. This isn't really about being fake or performing. It's closer to this. Hiring teams are trying to imagine working alongside you day to day, and comfort plus clarity tends to read as competence even when it isn't a perfect proxy for it. If you know your technical story is strong, it's worth spending equal energy on how naturally you can tell that story out loud. This shows up differently depending on the round, too. What a recruiter is screening for early on tends to be fairly different from what a hiring manager is weighing later, and a panel further down the process often has its own separate set of concerns entirely. So a one-size answer rarely performs the same way twice. Now here's where a lot of advice online tends to get it backwards. Sixth, by the time you reach the part of the interview where you're asked if you have questions, a decision has usually already taken shape in the interviewer's mind. That doesn't mean your questions are pointless. If you're genuinely trying to evaluate whether the company is right for you, that's a completely different purpose and a good one. But if you're saving your most impressive sounding questions for the very end, hoping they'll tip the scales, that's usually too late to meaningfully shift an impression that's already forming throughout the conversation. A better approach is weaving thoughtful, specific questions in earlier, naturally, while the impression of you is still being built rather than after it's mostly settled. Seventh, the salary expectation question causes a disproportionate amount of anxiety, and most of that anxiety isn't necessary. In most cases, this question isn't designed to trap you into naming a number too low. It's a practical filtering step. The company is trying to figure out early whether your expectations and their budget are even in the same neighborhood before investing more time. Treating it like a trick and dodging it entirely often reads as evasive rather than clever. The more useful approach is knowing your number ahead of time, based on real research into the role and market, and stating it with a calm, matter-of-fact tone. Confidence here tends to function as its own signal, separate from the number attached to it. Eighth, it's worth understanding that a recruiter liking you and advocating for you doesn't guarantee you make it past the next stage. Recruiters frequently push a candidate forward, present a strong case, and still watch a hiring manager pass, sometimes for reasons that are more about internal politics, unspoken preferences, or a hiring manager's own blind spots than anything measurable on your end. This can be genuinely frustrating for the recruiter, too. They don't always have full control over what happens once your file leaves their hands. So if you get an unexpected no after what felt like a strong recruiter conversation, it isn't necessarily a reflection that you weren't seriously considered. It may just mean the decision sat somewhere further up the chain than you realized, in a room you never got access to, and the recruiter may not have fully controlled either. And this next one explains a lot of the silence that tends to follow an interview. Ninth, long silences after an interview are rarely the recruiter dragging their feet on purpose. In most organizations, recruiters are measured on how quickly they fill open roles. So slow movement usually frustrates them just as much as it frustrates you. More often, the real bottleneck sits with a hiring manager who's busy, indecisive, or juggling other priorities and hasn't given feedback yet. That doesn't make the wait any less uncomfortable, but it does mean the silence isn't necessarily a verdict on you specifically. It's often just an organizational traffic jam the recruiter is stuck navigating from the other side. 10th, pace itself tends to function as a signal, even though it's an imperfect one. When a company is genuinely excited about a candidate, timelines have a way of compressing. Feedback comes faster, next steps get scheduled almost immediately, and decision makers suddenly find calendar time they didn't have the week before. On the other hand, a longer than expected gap often, though not always, means other candidates are still being evaluated in parallel. This is worth noticing, not treating as a guarantee. Sometimes delays really are just scheduling chaos. But if you notice a pattern of slow movement across multiple stages, it's reasonable to keep other options warm rather than pausing your search entirely. 11th, and this is the one people find hardest to believe. When someone is genuinely viewed as a standout hire, structure tends to bend around them more than most job seekers expect. Budgets can flex, headcount can occasionally be restructured, and equity or scope can shift to make an offer work, especially when a hiring manager is worried about losing a candidate to a competing offer. Internal referrals and existing champions inside a company can also move a candidate through the process faster than a cold application ever could. None of this is guaranteed, and it isn't something you can force, but it does mean the ceiling on outcomes is often higher than a posted range suggests, if you've genuinely made yourself the obvious choice. In systems I've seen this play out in, roles have been restructured, combined, or reshaped around one candidate simply because losing them felt riskier than adjusting the plan, which tells you the posted job description is often more of a starting draft than a fixed contract. So what does all of this actually mean for how you approach your next interview process? It means treating your resume as a 5-second decision document, not a life story. It means preparing your opening minutes as carefully as your hardest anticipated question. It means asking thoughtful questions earlier in the conversation instead of saving them for the end. It means knowing your salary number cold instead of dodging the question when it comes up. And it means understanding that silence after an interview is more often about internal bureaucracy than about you personally. So don't spiral over a slow reply, and don't assume a fast one guarantees the job either. It also means holding two things at once: staying genuinely prepared and confident in the room while keeping other conversations warm outside of it. Because even a process that feels like it's going well can stall for reasons that have nothing to do with your performance. A quick disclaimer here. Hiring practices vary a lot by company, industry, and country, and none of this is legal or financial advice. So treat these as general patterns worth watching for, rather than fixed rules that apply everywhere identically. Here's the honest version of all of this. Recruiters don't tell you these things because they're hiding some grand secret designed to keep you out. They don't tell you because most of this is just the unglamorous mechanics of a fast, high-volume, imperfect process that nobody bothers explaining out loud. Yes, this is real, but not in the way people usually assume it is. It's less about being tricked and more about understanding a system clearly enough to stop guessing your way through it. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually happening on the other side of the table, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And drop a comment letting me know which one of these caught you off guard. I read through those and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. Because next time, I'm breaking down what actually happens once a salary negotiation is on the table, and how far companies will really go to keep a strong candidate from walking away.